So we're now going to talk about stand downs and redundancy. So last year, when JobKeeper was in play, we had this concept under the Fair Work Act of the JobKeeper-enabled stand down. And what that did was allowed employers to direct employees ultimately to work lower numbers of hours. It allowed them to direct leave. It allowed them to do a few other things such as shift locations and so on and so forth. But the main benefit that they got out of that particular part of the Fair Work Act was the ability to reduce hours without necessarily getting agreement. Now we're in this situation where at the end of March, these provisions of the Fair Work Act effectively expired. So now we've got situations where we've still got the government lockdowns, but we don't have the industrial relations flexibility to enact something similar and to reduce hours. We're stuck in this all or nothing scenario where you either decide there's a stoppage of work and you stop and stand down your employees, or you continue with your employees and presumably not have enough work to provide them. And yes, sure, there'll be different views on how the case law falls on this, and that you could have partial stand downs or certain, sections of your workplace can be stood down. But what Section 524 doesn't seem to allow you to do is it doesn't really seem to allow you to have a kind of a 50-50 stand down where you can have employees working less hours, and because of the operational requirements, you might have some of your customers that can be serviced, but others that can't. And again, it's kind of this all or nothing situation, which just doesn't work. And workplaces are just not that black and white. And really what the government should be doing is immediately reinstating these sorts of provisions to allow employers the flexibility to reduce employees' hours, even if there's not necessarily agreement. And it doesn't matter if they're not providing JobKeeper. It shouldn't matter if the government's providing JobKeeper to allow businesses these flexibilities. If anything, the lack of JobKeeper makes it even more of a requirement to have the flexibilities to do these things. The business support, as we understand it at the moment, won't go kind of anywhere near what JobKeeper did in terms of assisting businesses through these particular times. Doesn't seem to be an explanation around why that is. So again, very disappointing that we haven't seen any temporary reform in industrial relations to allow businesses to do the sorts of things that they potentially were able to do last year. And you would have thought that these things would have automatically been reintroduced or put back on the table. And sure, I understand that the path to legislating these things is not always straightforward, but if there is opposing parties, well then one of two things has to happen. There either needs to be undertakings that we're going to need flexibility in industrial relations until further notice, or there needs to be undertakings from these premiers that, no more lockdowns. So there's got to be one or the other. We can't have a situation where you take away from the business the flexibilities, but then you're also prepared to lock down people at the drop of a hat. So very disappointing once again from the government. Poor planning, no industrial relations reform that's been put out there on this, and very disappointing. And now we've got a situation where a lot of these businesses in this particular second lockdown, if you like, in New South Wales, probably the second main lockdown, is that some of these are going to go to the wall. They've taken big hits last year, and yes, they got JobKeeper and that propped them up to some extent. And yes, this business support will give them some relief, but it doesn't go all the way to meeting their costs. It's the equivalent of businesses kind of being on the dole. It's a minimal payment. It doesn't cover the costs, and this business support is not going to make up for the losses in various situations. So we're going to see industries and businesses, quite a number of them, I expect, fall in the next few months. And not only that, there's been no relief on redundancy entitlements or notice entitlements for businesses. If you've got 15 employees, you'll be required to pay redundancy entitlements and notice entitlements with no due consideration. Yes, there is some provisions of Section 120 of the Fair Work Act that allows you to apply for reduction. But, again, that's a lengthy process. You've got to apply for reduction. It may have to go to a hearing or a decision. So that's not necessarily something straightforward either. Again, lack of planning and not good enough, quite frankly. There should be more for businesses to do in the IR space in relation to both stand downs and the possibility of redundancies, because I think we're going to see a number of redundancies just around the corner, particularly for those in the affected industries like hospitality. I really feel for those, the restaurants, pubs and clubs. How much longer can they go with these lockdowns? Not only that, it's going to kind of dovetail into my next slide about recruitment, because what we're also seeing now is this concept of what I would call industry migration. And people are looking at these sorts of industries and going, well, do I really want to be employed in this particular industry if this is the industry that's going to be first on the chopping block when government decides to undertake another lockdown? So those are the things that are starting to enter the minds of people, and that's making it even harder for hospitality businesses to operate post-lockdown and when they do return. That's where we'll leave it for today. So look, thanks very much for listening. If you've got any COVID-19 related questions or any of the concepts we've spoken about today, please reach out to On-Demand HR. I'd be happy to give you some assistance. Happy to explain to you also how we generally work with customers and clients to work through these types of issues. Thanks very much for your time.